Think about what you were worried about exactly 1 week ago, not in general. Specifically, the exact thing that was sitting in your chest at this time last Tuesday, the thing that kept circling back into your thoughts while you were trying to focus on something else, the thing you maybe lost a little sleep over. Can you remember it? Most people can't. And that is not a memory problem. That is one of the most important things your brain does, and almost nobody knows it is happening. Here is the number that started this. In a study published in the journal Anxiety, researcher Lucas Lafreniere tracked the worries of a group of adults over 30 days. Participants logged every worry they experienced, and then followed up weeks later to see how those worries resolved. What he found was striking. 91.4% of the things people worried about either never happened or happened, but turned out to be far less bad than the person had feared. Less than 1 in 10 worries led to an outcome as bad as the person had imagined. And yet the worrying happened anyway, every single time. This is the central puzzle of anxiety. Your brain is generating a response, a real, physical, exhausting response to a threat that, statistically, is almost certainly never going to arrive in the form you imagined. And even knowing this does not make the worry stop. You cannot think your way out of it. You cannot remind yourself of the statistics mid-panic. The feeling arrives before the logic does, and it hits harder, and it lasts longer, and it does not care what you know. The question is why? Why would a brain do this? Why would a system that evolved to keep you alive spend so much of its energy generating fear about things that will not happen? The answer takes you back about 300,000 years. Your brain was not designed for accuracy. It was designed for survival. And in the environment where it was built, the African savanna, small nomadic groups, constant exposure to predators and rival tribes and food scarcity, the cost of a false alarm was almost nothing. You heard a sound in the grass. You worried it was a predator. You tensed up, you prepared to run, you stayed on high alert for the next hour. And then, nothing happened. The cost of that worry? A little wasted energy. Maybe a slightly elevated heart rate for an hour, but the cost of not worrying, of dismissing the sound as nothing, and being wrong? Death. Your ancestors were not the calm ones. The calm ones died. The ones who survived, the ones whose genes you carry right now, were the catastrophizers, the worriers. The people whose brains generated threat signals early, often, and loudly, even when most of those signals turned out to be wrong. Being wrong most of the time was not a flaw, it was the whole point. A brain that worried constantly, and was right 10% of the time, was infinitely more useful than a brain that only worried when there was genuine reason to, but occasionally missed something fatal. You are the descendant of 10,000 generations of people who worried too much, and their worry kept them alive long enough to become your ancestors. Neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux spent decades mapping what he called the fear circuit, the pathway in the brain that generates threat responses. What he found changed how scientists think about anxiety. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, receives sensory information and flags potential threats before the information even reaches the cortex, the thinking part of your brain. The signal goes low road, straight to response, before you have had any chance to evaluate whether the threat is real. By the time your prefrontal cortex gets the information and could theoretically talk you down, your heart is already pounding, your breathing has already changed, your muscles are already tensing. The worry arrives before the wisdom. This is why telling yourself to calm down rarely works in the moment. The calm down message is coming from a part of the brain that received the threat signal second. It is trying to override a system that already has a head start. But here is what makes this stranger. The amygdala does not just respond to real sensory input. It responds to imagined input too. Your brain cannot fully distinguish between a threat happening right now and a threat you are vividly imagining. When you lie awake at 3 a.m. running through a scenario of everything that could go wrong in an upcoming conversation, your amygdala is responding as if the conversation is happening right now. Your body is producing cortisol and adrenaline for a confrontation that does not exist yet and may never exist. You are experiencing the physiological stress of a threat that lives entirely in your own mind. Psychologist Michelle Newman at Penn State has studied what she calls the function of worry, and her findings are deeply counterintuitive. People worry, she found, partly because it feels like doing something. Worrying gives the brain a sense of engagement with a problem. It feels like preparation. It feels like, if you just think about it enough, from enough angles, you will eventually find the thing that makes it safe. But worry is not preparation. Worry is rehearsal for catastrophe. It keeps the threat signal active without moving you any closer to resolution. Newman's research also found something else. People who worry chronically often do so because, on some level, they believe the worrying is protective. If I worry about this enough, maybe I can prevent it. If I stop worrying, I will be caught off guard. There is a magical thinking component buried inside chronic anxiety, a sense that the worry itself is keeping the bad thing at bay. It is not. But your brain does not know that. Now think about why you cannot remember what you worried about last week. It is not because your memory is bad. It is because your brain, once a threat has passed, deprioritizes it. The worry served its function. It kept you on alert. It kept the threat active in your mind. It mobilized your resources. And then the threat passed, or the moment passed, or life moved on. And the brain, which is always trying to be efficient, let it go. It filed it somewhere inaccessible because it was no longer needed. This is actually adaptive. A brain that held on to every resolved worry with perfect clarity would be paralyzed. You need to be able to move on. And so the brain does something elegant. It keeps the worry alive exactly as long as the threat feels active, and then it releases it once the coast is clear. The problem is the ratio. Your brain is generating weeks of worry for problems that resolve in minutes. You are spending 7 days dreading a conversation that takes 7 minutes and goes fine. You are spending 3 days anxious about a medical test result that comes back normal. The worry is disproportionate not because you are broken, but because your brain is using ancient calibration on modern problems. On the savannah, a threat that lasted a week probably still needed your full attention at the end of the week. Predators did not have schedules. Rival tribes did not send meeting invites. The threat environment was continuous and unpredictable, and sustained vigilance was rational. But your performance review is not a predator. Your awkward text conversation is not a rival tribe. The threat resolved, or will resolve, on a human timescale. The worry has not caught up. Psychologist Robert Leahy, who has spent decades studying the cognitive patterns behind anxiety, makes a distinction that cuts to the heart of this. He separates what he calls productive worry from unproductive worry. Productive worry is worry that leads to action. You are worried about your health, so you book the appointment. You are worried about the project deadline, so you make a plan. The worry has a function. It moves you toward resolution. Unproductive worry is everything else, the circular, repetitive, escalating anxiety that returns to the same thought again and again without producing any new information or moving you any closer to an outcome. Most worry is unproductive, not because people are weak or irrational, but because the brain's threat system was not designed to distinguish between problems that have solutions and problems that do not. It activates for both. It runs at the same intensity for both, and it keeps running until the threat is gone, regardless of whether there is anything you can actually do about it. Here is the thing about that 93%. The worries you cannot remember from last week, they are gone not because they were never real, but because they resolved. Life absorbed them. The conversation happened, and it was fine. The email came back, and it was not what you feared. The thing you were dreading arrived, and turned out to be smaller than it looked from a distance. Your brain generated a week of cortisol for a problem that took minutes to dissolve, and next week, it will do it again. Not because it is broken, because it is doing exactly what it was built to do in a world that no longer requires it to do that. You are carrying the most sophisticated threat detection system ever built inside a skull that is commuting to work and checking emails and trying to decide what to have for dinner. It is scanning for predators in a world that has almost none. It is preparing you for catastrophe in a life where most days end fine. The worries you cannot remember are the proof. Almost none of them came true, and yet every single one of them felt, in the moment, like it might. That is not a you problem. That is the oldest, most human thing about you.